Welcome everyone to this presentation on the Cyber Resilience Act. Just to go through, today I'll introduce myself in a moment, and then I will give a little bit of background about kind of the legal landscape that the CRA sits in. I will talk about the scope of the legislation, look at core requirements that may fall on your organizations that you might be subject to and what it means. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline and key focus areas that you need to be thinking about and sort of the next steps. There is another webinar that we have scheduled at the end of April, where we will start to look at sort of like these implementation steps in a little bit more detail. So we will today just kind of look at the overarching sort of requirements and sort of key things that you need to be considering. So just to give a little bit of an introduction about myself, my name is Linda Willard. I'm a consultant with Secufy. I've been working in information security, data protection and privacy for over 30 years now. And as you can tell, I'm British, but I am in Sweden. My Swedish is still not very good, hence the reason we are doing this in English. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background. I have been involved with ISO 27001. I am also studying for a SOC 2 lead auditor reporting certification. So I have a background in security auditing. Essentially, I have been getting more and more into sort of like the new laws that are coming into effect with regard to the EU. So the Cyber Resilience Act, NIS2, the AI Act and the Data Act specifically, but also I've been looking much further into sort of like all of kind of the harmonized laws that kind of fall into scope for a lot of businesses these days. So if you have any questions, please can you put it into the chat? So I'm monitoring that, and then sort of if I see a question, then I'll answer as best I can as I go. Okay. So just to kind of give a little bit of a background, the EU some time ago, as part of the move towards the digital single market, started to implement something called the EU Digital Decade. And the objectives for this are set out to essentially build a safe and secure digital world, to ensure public services are online and available to everyone online, ensuring everyone can participate in digital opportunities. And one of the key things here is ensuring all organizations adopt cybersecurity measures. Traditionally, sort of a lot of products have been notoriously lacking in security, particularly IoT devices, where time to market is the key objective, and often came at the cost of a secure development. So part of this digital decade is to make sure that all organizations adopt cybersecurity measures. And that is kind of partly behind the legal framework that's involved with NIS2, the CRA, and there. So The other parts of this are about ensuring small businesses and industry can access data and adopt digital technologies, which is predominantly behind the idea of the Data Act and sharing data to develop new technologies using data, ensuring small, medium enterprises can compete in a digital world on fairer terms. So quite often small organizations can be at a disadvantage when negotiating contracts with larger organizations. So part of the legislative framework is to make sure that micro, small and medium enterprises are not unfairly burdened. And there are references to these size organizations in the Cyber Resilience Act in terms of making sure that it is not a burden to those organizations compared to large organizations. Promoting the deployment of innovative infrastructures and promoting research focused on measuring the impact of digital technologies and developing sustainable energy and resource efficient innovations. So this is kind of what has been going on for the last 6 years. And every year there is a report of the state of play with the digital decade. So basically, this is the kind of framework that the CRA and NIS2 sits in. There is a digital strategy, a data strategy, and a cybersecurity strategy that drives a lot of the policy and project work that the EU has behind this. So here you can kind of see that the rules section is where you have rules on artificial intelligence, rules on data governance, and basically these laws that are in place to kind of make sure that we end up with secure products. And as part of this framework, the work that has been ongoing over the last 6 years has been essentially to harmonize laws. So what you will find is that a lot of the laws were updated and either implemented in a new version, such as the General Product Safety Regulation has been sort of newly implemented to replace the previous version. But there is a consistency across these laws. So when the EU, when the EU is looking at conformity with the legislation, these conformity assessments are defined in specific market surveillance legislation, and those are referred to within the specific laws. So there is a consistent standard across the laws. With regard to the Cyber Resilience Act, when we look at the scope, some sectors are exempted from the Cyber Resilience Act, or some have a limited impact by the Cyber Resilience Act because they are already covered by sector-specific laws. So the aviation sector, vehicle sector, marine equipment, medical devices, and in vitro diagnostic medical devices are specifically covered by different pieces of legislation that set out security requirements for those devices. As such, the Cyber Resilience Act does not necessarily apply to these sectors where those particular pieces of legislation already set out an equivalent level of protection. However, some parts of those sectors aren't covered under those laws, so those would fall under the Cyber Resilience Act. So, for example, the aviation safety regulation requires certification of products involved in the aviation industry. However, some are exempted from certification. So, drones that are for leisure and low-risk commercial activities are exempted from that certification under the aviation law, and those would therefore fall under the Cyber Resilience Act. So if you are subject to those laws, whether it's that specific law or the Cyber Resilience Act, you have to look at sort of whether what it is that you're producing is covered by the sector-specific law, and if not, if it's covered by the Cyber Resilience Act. Okay. There are other pieces of legislation. So just to give you an example of how much, these are the laws that are actually referenced throughout the recitals and the legal text within the Cyber Resilience Act. So there is quite a number of laws. So obviously the Artificial Intelligence Act is referenced in Article 12, so that it talks about the need for conformity with high-risk AI systems. It talks about the RED directive or Radio Equipment Directive and the relevant cybersecurity delegated regulation that came about. And again, there are pieces within the Cyber Resilience Act where it looks at where there is such a delegated regulation for RED, where there is that equivalent level of protection, then the Cyber Resilience Act may not necessarily apply, but it also talks about under which act one would look for doing your conformity assessment. So these laws all kind of come into play on this. Just one thing to sort of make clear here. There is a lot of references in the Cyber Resilience Act to the Cybersecurity Act, and those references actually relate to the EU Cybersecurity Act. The Swedish Cybersecurity Act that came into force in January is actually the Swedish implementation of the NIS2 directive. So when we talk about Cybersecurity Act, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm actually talking about the EU Cybersecurity Act and not the Swedish version. So just to be clear that there is that distinction here. The other thing to also understand is that because the Cyber Resilience Act talks about product safety, under the General Product Safety Regulation, the definition of a safe product now includes secure. So if your product is not secure, it is not deemed to be safe. And as such, you could potentially face being required by a market surveillance authority to remove the product from the market in terms of a withdrawal or recall, or bring it up to the required safety specifications in the CRA in order to continue to sell the product on the market. So all of these come into effect. The Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, this is partly in here as well because there are obligations in terms of recycling, in terms of packaging, and how you actually implement the CE markings for the conformity assessments. So all of these have an impact. So it's useful to understand just kind of the legal framework that the CRA sits in on this. When we talk about the scope of the legislation, By definition, the regulation applies to products with digital elements made available on the EU market where the intended purpose or reasonably foreseeable use of which includes a direct or indirect logical or physical data connection to a device or network. So if we look at the definitions in a little bit more depth, a product with a digital element is a software or hardware product and its remote data processing solutions, including software or hardware components being placed on the market separately. So if you develop a product and you also develop an app with it, then that is likely to fall as a product with digital elements. And whether you release the product and the app separately or together, it doesn't matter. You can place them on the market separately or combined. It would still fall within the definition. Now, the key here with remote data processing solutions is remote data processing is data processing at a distance for which the software is designed and developed by the manufacturer or under the responsibility of the manufacturer, and the absence of which would prevent the product with digital elements from functioning. Now, the key for this definition is that if we are talking about a cloud provider that provides a platform that you as a software as a service or SaaS provider use, that cloud provider is providing the platform. So that has nothing essentially to do with the functioning of the product. So essentially the cloud providers will fall under NIS2 directive. So they are covered in terms of security from that perspective. But even though the wording of managed service provider in the NIS2 directive can be a little vague and include providers of ICT products or applications or any other network information system, generally the legal interpretation means that SaaS providers are excluded from the NIS2 directive. So by including this definition of software or hardware product and its remote data processing solutions, if you are building a SaaS solution where your customers will be using this and you are kind of having this remote data processing for managing that service, then you will be covered by the CRA. So essentially, the way that this legislation has been written is that NIS2 and the CRA complement each other. If you're covered by the CRA, you will fall under kind of this processing. If you're falling under NIS2 as a cloud provider, you're excluded from the CRA. So essentially, the other part of the guidance that comes out is websites that do not provide a support functionality for a product are not themselves products in scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. However, if you provide a website that does provide some functionality, then that website will be in scope of the Cyber Resilience Act, essentially as far as that functionality goes. So when it comes to looking at what is in scope, you need to look very carefully at what you're doing, the services and products that you're providing, and kind of whether there is a level of functionality being provided. The other part of the definition is including a direct or indirect logical or physical data connection to a device or network. If you're producing a device that is not intended to connect to another device or network, then it is outside of the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. So, for example, if you have a dishwasher with embedded firmware, but there is no capability to connect to other devices, so that would be outside of the scope. That firmware would not be within the scope of the CRA. However, if you have a dishwasher that has firmware, but an engineer can go out and can connect to that device and pull off diagnostic data, then that would fall within the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. So again, this definition will kind of determine whether your products and services will fall into the Cyber Resilience Act. As I mentioned earlier, there are exemptions. There are exemptions for the sector-specific laws, so for aviation, for vehicle products, for marine equipment, for medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. There are also exemptions if you are producing spare parts, and those spare parts are being produced to the exact same specification as the components they're replacing. That is exempted from the Cyber Resilience Act. In addition, if the product that you are producing is aimed to process data for national defense purposes or process classified information, that is exempted from the Cyber Resilience Act, generally because those will have far higher security requirements by default than what is set out in the Cyber Resilience Act. So, okay. So the other interesting part of this is the reasonably foreseeable use. There is also a definition in the law of reasonably foreseeable misuse. And that actually comes into play because when you are doing your risk assessments, which are obligated as a manufacturer of a product with digital elements, you actually have to build your risk assessments around foreseeable use and foreseeable misuse, particularly if your products are classified as important or critical under the legislation. So this is where you have to look at kind of reasonably foreseeable human behavior in terms of how people use a product or how technical operations are likely to develop or interactions also develop. I think this will be a rather interesting area for kind of legal enforcement as to what is reasonable for one person in terms of foreseeable use or misuse. But these definitions will have an impact in terms of how you do your risk assessments on here. So, with regard to the scope, if a product, please clarify where the line is drawn regarding which software is included within the scope. For example, would a customer service program that can be installed locally be considered in scope, while the same functionality provided purely as a web-based scope? And if mobile app is standalone. Okay, so just to answer that first question, essentially, what we're looking at for software, if you are providing a software and you are placing it on the market, then it would be kind of considered a product with digital elements, because the product is software or hardware. Essentially, what you're looking at again is kind of, with this, includes a direct or indirect logical or physical data connection to a device or network. So that would essentially start to look at whether that kind of would be in scope. I think that is something that is something that I can come back to you on. I will look further into the guidance on that and clarify. But if a mobile app is developed standalone, i.e. not together with or as part of a physical product, would such a standalone mobile app be excluded from the scope of the CRA? No, a mobile app, if it's separate from a physical product, if it provides functionality for that product, so for example, you could put a robotic lawnmower out on the market, and then kind of provide an app later on to provide functionality of managing that robotic lawnmower, then essentially that app would be covered by the CRA because it's providing functionality. It's going to depend entirely on what the purpose of the app is and what the core functionality is, but it is almost certain if it's providing any kind of functionality for the product and is put on the market separately, then it would still be subject to the CRA. Just to clarify, that I said SaaS providers are not covered by NIS2, is that correct? This has been an ongoing conversation I've been having with several clients in terms of my interpretation of the definition of managed service provider under NIS2, where I look at that definition and I see that the definition includes someone who provides a managed ICT product. And then if you look at the definition of ICT product under the EU Cybersäkerhetsakten Act, it is essentially a product that processes data, and that definition of managed service provider also includes provision of an application or access to any other network or information system. I kind of take that as potentially SaaS providers can fall under that, but when you kind of look into sort of like the legal analysis, it has tended to be that SaaS providers have not fallen under that in terms of application of the law. So my understanding from sort of the reading I've been doing over the last couple of weeks is that, while, if you're a SaaS provider, you might fall under that. It has tended, I think, to be much more about like the underlying cloud provider that falls under NIS2. And as such, as I mentioned, NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act are kind of complementary pieces of legislation. So if NIS2 doesn't apply, then the Cyber Resilience Act will. And they have kind of complementary security requirements. Obviously, the requirements under NIS2 are much more stringent because it's critical national infrastructure. But my understanding is that SaaS providers are more likely to have requirements under the CRA than NIS2. I have submitted an article to our legal counsel for clarification of this, because as I said, I have several clients that I'm kind of working with, and this is going to be quite an important distinction. So once I've received kind of feedback on that to clarify my understanding of the legal position, then that's something we can kind of update you with. So, okay. So, the roles under the Cyber Resilience Act are defined as manufacturer, importer, distributor, authorized representative, and there is also a free and open source software steward role, which I will talk about in a moment. A manufacturer is defined in the law as a natural or legal person that develops or manufactures products with digital elements, so hardware or software, or has such products designed, developed, and manufactured for them, and then markets those products under its name or trademark, whether for payment, monetization, or for free. So again, there are provisions in the Cyber Resilience Act where it looks at whether you are placing something on the market or making it available on the market in terms of, is it a commercial activity or not? And you know, for example, if you are a manufacturer and you are developing products for your own use and you're not putting them on the market, they are outside of the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. It's only if you make them available on the market for customers that you start to fall within kind of, is it being made available? Because the definition is it has to be made available, i.e. placed on the market in a commercial activity. So if you are a manufacturer of a product with digital elements, the bulk of the obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act fall on you. And it is your obligation to make sure that you are developing secure products. An importer is a natural or legal person other than the manufacturer who places on the market a product with digital elements that bears a name or trademark of a natural or legal person established outside of the EU. So essentially, if we have a manufacturer who is based in a third country, an importer can basically place their product on the market and act as an importer. There are certain obligations for the importer for doing so, but they are much less than are placed on the manufacturer. A distributor is a natural or legal person other than the manufacturer or importer who's involved in the supply chain that makes a product with digital elements available on the market without affecting its properties. And the key to that description is without affecting its properties. There is an article within the Cyber Resilience Act that makes clear that if you're an importer or distributor and you have this product from a manufacturer and you subsequently make substantial modifications to it, then you may well be seen as a manufacturer. If not, at least for the level of substantial modifications that you make to the product. But if your substantial modifications affect the entire security position of the product, you may be considered the manufacturer of that product as a whole. So that affecting its properties is quite key, because if you change something and substantially modify it, then that might actually make you the manufacturer from the legal perspective. So it needs to be clear that, you know, if you are just part of the supply chain, you're not the importer, and you are just providing the product, then you are a distributor. So an authorized representative, kind of similar to having authorized representatives under GDPR, is where you have a manufacturer outside of the EU. They can appoint an authorized representative to engage on their behalf, and it has to have a written mandate, and the manufacturer must provide all the documentation to the representative, because it will be the representative who will deal with market surveillance authorities, who will deal with the CSERTs in terms of kind of vulnerabilities, etc. So these roles are quite key, and it's important that you understand that for your product what role you are kind of taking on. With regard to the core requirements for manufacturing of a product with digital elements, security by design and security by default is an essential requirement. So this requires you to have a secure development process. It requires you to make sure that any product that you put on the market is secure by default. You have to have risk assessment and technical documentation as part of your conformity assessment. So if you have a product that is on the market, a market surveillance authority may ask to see this documentation, and this is defined in the annex, in Annex 7 of the Act, as to what is included in the technical documentation. But it is a risk assessment. It is the technical documentation. So it will also include essentially your conformity declarations as well. But you must have a clear risk assessment, and you must have appropriate technical documentation. The reason for this is because there is a requirement under the Act for a software bill of materials, and because of critical supply chain issues, market surveillance authorities can be tasked to contact manufacturers of products with digital elements and ask for this software bill of materials. This software bill of materials is essentially all the software components that you use within a product. So if you are using free or open source software, if you are using developed software by a third party, this is kind of where you have to have this. And the key for this is because sort of it ties into like the NIS2 requirements, that they're looking for critical supply chains and trying to kind of ensure that there is a secure supply chain in this. But you need to have a software bill of materials, which is essentially the suppliers of your software. As part of the Market Surveillance Authority activities, they can also ask you for who you have provided your products to. So if you're providing software, you may also be asked to provide your customers as part of the Market Surveillance Authority activities. But you need to have a software bill of materials produced. And that also requires doing due diligence on third-party components, be it software or hardware. If it's hardware, that can be relatively easy if the device actually already carries a CE marking, because then you have you've kind of done your due diligence to see that there is that conformity marking already in place. Due diligence with regard to software, again, it comes down to sort of how you do that. For free and open source software, there is a provision that security attestation can be carried out by a FOSS steward in order to have a security declaration for any free or open source components. But you are expected to only use components in your products that are secure, that do not create vulnerabilities, that do not create security risks going forward. You are also obligated to determine the support period. Now, the support period is an interesting concept, because essentially it is the life of your product. However, it is expected to be at least 5 years, unless the product has a very short life cycle. You are also expected to keep kind of documentation frequently for 10 years. So essentially this determination of the support period is going to be critical. It's also going to be affected by Market Surveillance Authority activities, because they will start to kind of look at products in categories. And for example, if you have 5 manufacturers who have a support period of 10 years, and I'm a manufacturer and only have a support period of 2 years, I'm probably going to get a visit from the Market Surveillance Authority kind of wanting to know why I'm kind of out of sync with the other manufacturers in that category. So I'm going to come on to open source software again in a moment in terms of the obligations on the steward, so I can address that question. So the determination of the support period is also part of your documentation and part of the documentation that the Market Surveillance Authority will want to look at. The retention of documentation for 10 years, or whichever is longer. If the support period is longer, then you have to keep it for that length of time. And that also includes vulnerabilities and making those available for consumers as well. There are a lot of obligations here with regard to how long you keep things and how much you make things available to the consumers of the product. You must have a clear vulnerability handling process. This is in Annex 1, Part 2, where it sets out you have very clear handling requirements in terms of identifying vulnerabilities, essentially addressing those vulnerabilities kind of without undue delay, and essentially pushing out kind of patches. And there are clear rules on this. So, for example, you should not push out functionality patches with security patches. They should be separate kind of patching on this. So you have a lot of requirements here in terms of how you manage vulnerabilities in your products. You also have an obligation as a manufacturer of reporting actively exploited vulnerabilities and significant incidents. So there is some guidance in terms of what an actively exploited vulnerability is. If you have if you find a 0-day vulnerability or a bug bounty hunter has found a 0-day vulnerability, but you do not believe that it's been actively exploited, that is not a reportable actively exploited vulnerability. It's only if you believe that the vulnerability has been actively exploited that you need to report as a manufacturer. And a significant incident is one that has kind of quite significant detrimental impacts, not just on sort of your organization, but sort of onward products that might use your product or for consumers on here. But you are actively required to report these things. You need to make security updates available and keep them available. So again, you essentially have to make sure that these patches are available to consumers. Can I come back to the DORA questions towards the end on this? The conformity assessments and declarations, you must make sure that you have those conformity declarations and assessments done. And you need to comply with the Act in how you do those. And we'll talk about that in a moment. You also have to provide a single point of contact for consumers and market surveillance authorities. So again, you need to have the ability within the organization to kind of have someone being able to manage reporting of vulnerabilities, reporting of bugs or things like this, and for market surveillance authorities to contact. And you also have to comply with Annex 2 with all the information that you are obligated to provide to the consumer. So there is a list in Annex 2 that you need to make sure is provided. So this is quite a chunky kind of set of obligations. If you're an importer or distributor, then you have to do due diligence on the manufacturer to make sure that they've completed the technical documentation, that they've got the conformity assessments and declarations, that they've got the CE markings. If you discover non-conformity, you cannot sell the product or distribute it until that's rectified. And you are obligated to notify the manufacturer of the non-conformity and the market surveillance authorities in the member states where the products are being made available. You must retain the technical documentation, conformity assessments and declarations for 10 years after the product is sold or for the length of the support period if it's longer, and must assist market surveillance authorities. And in the event a manufacturer ceases operations, you must notify market surveillance authorities immediately and attempt to notify all the users of the situation that this manufacturer will not be able to comply with the Act going forward. An authorized representative must act according to written mandate, must retain the documentation, and must assist market surveillance authorities. So quite relatively straightforward. Free and open source software stewards. If a company acts as a FOSS steward, they have specific responsibilities. They must put in place and document a cybersecurity policy to foster the development of a secure product. And such policy must foster voluntary vulnerability reporting. They must assist market surveillance authorities, including mitigating risks in a product. They must report obligations only to the extent they are involved in their product or to the extent a severe incident will affect their product. And they should avail themselves of voluntary security attestation programs. Now, with regard to the responsibility of assessing a specific open source package, if an open source package has this security attestation, then that is kind of a level of due diligence that you've taken. There isn't anything that says that you cannot use an open source software in your product. But obviously part of your product development in terms of secure development and secure design and secure configuration, you should be doing security testing, and it should be your own security testing that identifies whether that product is adequately secure for your purposes or not. So there is nothing in the law that says you cannot use a piece of free or open source software if it hasn't got security attestation. But it does mean that you still have to do a level of due diligence in terms of testing and making sure that it doesn't introduce vulnerabilities into your product on that. When we talk about conformity assessments, there are different types of conformity assessments, and under the Cyber Resilience Act, these kind of apply to the different products. So the product categories are defined in the annexes. So important products are in Annex 3, and they are defined into Class 1 and Class 2, with Class 2 being the more security sensitive products. Critical products are more secure. Whether your product falls as an important or critical product, you're looking at its core functionality. So you can use a critical product into your product, but that doesn't automatically make your product a critical product. So it comes down to the core functionality of your product. So again, this is something that you're going to need to look at if you're a manufacturer and developing these products and you are using important or critical components. You know, it depends on how much of the core functionality is based on those components. So you need to kind of be aware of this. Now, the internal control, Module A, is a self-assessment approach. The Module B and Module C, the EU type examination and internal production control, are defined within Annex A, Part 2 and Part 3, and it sets out all these requirements. Critical products that could be mandated a certification scheme require you to essentially have that certification conducted. And the full quality assurance is an assessment that is carried out by a notified body, i.e. a third party on this. So depending on what you produce, it will depend on whether you can self-assess, whether you can follow the Module B or Module C assessments, or whether you need to use a notified body. Yes. When we talk about the timeframes, the regulation will apply from the 11th of December 2027. So we still have some time. However, in Article 71.2, other dates apply. If you're a manufacturer, your Article 14 reporting obligations starts to apply from the 11th of September this year. So you have to essentially be ready to report actively exploited vulnerabilities or severe incidents for this. Articles 35 to 51 is about the setting up of conformity assessment bodies and the notifying authority, etc. So this is more specifically to do with the administration of the law, but these will start to come into effect from the 11th of June. So just to be very clear, if you place a product on the market before the 11th of December 2027, it is not within scope of the CRA unless you make a substantial modification to it. You can continue to patch it after, providing that isn't a substantial modification, that product will never fall under the CRA. However, if you say you manufacture 20,000 lawnmowers and you sell 10,000 of those before the 11th of December, those will not be subject to the CRA. However, if you then make available the other 10,000 after, those would be subject to the CRA, because you are putting those on the market after the CRA comes into force. So you need to sort of be aware of this sort of applicability. Okay. So in terms of what you need to do, are you ready for the reporting obligations that start in September? Do you have clear incident identification and incident handling processes? Do you know how to report? Do you know who to report to? These are things that you have to prepare. Obviously, there is a single reporting platform that you will use, but you need to be prepared for this. Are you clear on what your role will be under the CRA if it applies? Are you clear of what your obligations are? Do you know where you are and what needs to be done to ensure compliance? So these are the key things. Having sort of talked around a lot of the law, there are a lot of obligations if you are a manufacturer or developer of a product with digital elements, and you need to be prepared for all these obligations and implementing the essential cybersecurity requirements. And do you know how you are going to look at conformity? Will it be a normal product, important or critical product? Do you know whether you will self-assess or use a notified body? You can use a notified body even for a normal product. Is obviously notified body is for a specific category of product where it's mandated. Are you prepared to make the conformity declarations? And do you have all the necessary documentation? You can kind of make a conformity declaration without having the technical documentation, but you won't actually be in conformity if you do that. So essentially, your next steps: determine whether the CRA applies, determine your role, determine your obligations, conduct a gap analysis of where you are now to where you need to be, and develop an implementation plan. As I mentioned, the next webinar is on the 28th of April, which is a more in-depth look at the CRA. And this is where we will start to talk about your obligations in a lot more depth, look at gap analysis and an implementation plan for that. So, that we can kind of go through that in a lot more detail. With regard to the DORA question, if a bank has a website where customers can log in to apply for a new loan or set up payment, would that website fall outside? I need to check on that and come back because I think I need to look further into that, Dora. So can I come back to you on that with a more clarified position? Because I'm not quite sure whether Dora takes precedence over the CRA. I know that there is a reference to Dora in the CRA, but off the top of my head, I can't remember that. So can I come back to you with a confirmed answer at a later point on that? So just to kind of point out that Secufy is here that we can kind of help you with gap analysis towards the CRA and other legislation such as NIS2, looking at your current setup against the CRA requirements and looking at compliance gaps. And if you're not sure if you're subject to legal regulation yet, we have lawyers who can conduct legal assessments to determine whether your organisation falls within the scope of the CRA and other applicable regulations. But please feel free to kind of reach out to me with any other questions that you have on this. Okay. So, any other questions? Okay. Okay, well, thank you for your time. And as I said, if there's any questions that you have, please reach out, and I will try and answer them as best I can. And then I will come back with regard to these questions that need clarification in an email that I can get Henrik to send to you. Okay, thank you for your time. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. There is a lot in the CRA, so even kind of this is quite a lot to go through, which is why sort of we kind of want to take another webinar at the end of April just to really kind of focus on particularly like on manufacturer requirements and the conformity assessments, to kind of really dig a lot deeper into that for that. So, okay. Well, thank you.